Welcome to the heart of the Slav Defense, where we'll explore the main line in a clear, beginner-friendly manner. We dive into it by playing a4 on move 5. It's a bold decision, weakening b4, but it sets the stage for regaining the c4 pawn. There's no way black can keep their extra pawn. If bishop e6, white has e4 and then knight g5. Therefore, the best option is to continue developing, and bishop f5 is the best way to do it. Because black would like to play e6 without blocking in the light square bishop. They can also try bishop g4 with the idea to invite knight e5 and then challenge it with knight bd7. However, white gets a chance to play f3 followed by e4, grabbing a lot of space and excluding the h5 bishop from the rest of the board. Even in case of bishop f5, white can play knight e5, with the same idea, f3 and e4, but this time it doesn't come with the tempo, and that's why we prefer playing e3 here. For black, there is nothing better than e6, and then bishop takes c4. You're probably wondering how many moves are required to learn, how far to go. But it is better to look at it as learning to play logical chess without memorizing. We'll continue in that manner. And thinking of the next move for black, we cannot overlook their bishop on f5. In the queen's gambit, it stares its own pawns from c8. Now being on f5, it may seem like black has gained an advantage. But there is a price. Compared to the standard queen's gambit, in this variation of the Slav, black no longer has their pawn on d5, leaving white with an advantage in the center. Ideally, white would want to advance e4 at some point. Therefore, black plays bishop b4, pinning the knight, which supports this advance. White castles, and black can either play knight bd7 or castle as well. It's almost the same, but we'll deal with the slight differences between these two moves later. Regardless of what happens, we play the same move, queen e2, supporting the idea of building a nice pawn center. And that's as far as you should go with learning moves. Next is studying the ideas that may rise from this pawn structure. We see an obvious weakness on b4, which black often transforms into an outpost. On the other side, white enjoys greater space and control in the center. Those who play this line with white think having control in the center is more important than the weakness on the flank. But black won't just let white dominate the center without a fight, and their typical pawn breaks are c5 and e5. If c5 is played, it either leads to a symmetrical pawn structure or leaves white with an isolated queen's pawn. In either case, white shouldn't be too pleased, mainly due to the remaining weakness on the queen side. If black chooses e5, they regain space, but white often ends up with a central versus queenside pawn majority. And the final assessment in this scenario depends on where the rest of the pieces are. If black refrains from advancing their central pawns or delays for too long, the usual plan involves gaining space and setting up a position for a kingside attack by advancing e4 and e5. Now, while this idea weakens d4 and d5, it also forces the black knight away from f6, which is a key defender of the king. Now, when the knight comes to d5, white faces a crucial decision: to trade knights or centralize their own on e4. It should be fine if black dark square bishop is off the board and d6 square available as an outpost. But our main focus is gonna be on the pawn structure that occurs after knight takes d5. If e takes d5, the goal is to utilize the kingside pawn majority to gain space with the f-pawn. On the other hand, c takes d5 creates the French defense pawn structure. And despite black's light square bishop being outside of the pawn chain, white is typically well developed and ready to launch a quick attack on the kingside. In the main line Slav, black's light square bishop typically sits on g6, while white is on d3. Initially, looks like great news for every French defense player who struggles to get rid of the poor bishop. But black is not out of the woods yet, especially after getting these pawns doubled on the g-file. The thing is, white gets a chance to cement their knight on g5, then team up with a queen, and sometimes even throw in the rook on the h-file. Another sneaky plan is pushing h4, h5 to weaken black's king by removing a pawn. And all this works well for white even when the center is a bit more flexible, with pawns on c6 and e6, including white's pawn advancing to e5. A common attacking maneuver for white is what we call the Greek gift sacrifice. Here we have an immediate opportunity to exploit the position of the undefended g4 bishop. However, there are other compelling reasons to sacrifice on h7. For instance, consider the current position where moves like queen h3 followed by g4 are highly effective. It's common to see knight g5 move in this setup, which often induces bishop g6, while in case of h6 it can maneuver to h3 and f4. Sometimes even knight h7 is interesting. After rook d8, knight f6, check, g takes f, e takes f, white is threatening queen g3, so king f8 is required, bishop takes h6, king e8, and g4. And that's curtains for black. Another great strategy for white involves sacrificing the b-pawn. Its true value actually lies in opening up the a3, f8 diagonal. For example, after h3 and e4, black is in danger due to the weak dark squares. They can forget about castling short, and if they try for the long side, there is the open file. Seems like black is ready to strike in the center with e5, but it is white to move. If we opt for bishop f4, unfortunately black can take on f3, advance the pawn, and whatever we do from that moment onwards, they'll bring the knight to e5, taking away our bishop pair advantage. But this example shows that the f3 knight plays an important role in stopping e5, and that's why sometimes we should seriously consider g4. Looks ugly, but if we keep the center under control, we keep the advantage. Then we need to add another surprising resource to prevent black from executing the e5 pawn break, by using the tricky move bishop d3. The idea is twofold: to defend our e4 pawn, which was hanging, and to dare black to continue with their plan, because if black plays e5, we take, and after all these exchanges, there is f4 followed by f5, trapping the bishop. Now this position arises if white chooses knight h4 over queen e2. It's not a typical position we encounter, since I'm not recommending playing the knight h4 move right away, but it's valuable to know that white can indeed pursue the advantage of the bishop pair. We should be aware that they may allow us to capture the bishop and even double their pawns, but in return they gain better control over the center. This prevents our e4 idea, while they can safely cement a knight on d5 and possibly another one on e4. Consequently, our c1 bishop remains passive. Overall, very interesting and active idea for black. Every French defense player knows that in this pawn structure, black must have a knight on c6, putting pressure on the weak d4 pawn. In this case, the black knight is even encouraged to get there. It may seem awkward to use the b8 square, but once it reaches c6, it pays off. Another maneuver available for black involves the queen. The first move required is bishop g4, clearing the fifth rank, followed by queen a5, attacking c3. White may be willing to sacrifice the c3 pawn to gain greater control over the center and dark squares, but black is not interested, and the game starts to resemble the Ninja Indian, only with double pawns on the king side. That's why once the black bishop moves to g4, I would suggest playing h3 right away, forcing the bishop to h5, preventing the whole plan. There are many positions where keeping the bishop on b4 doesn't do much, especially when the white knight moves away from c3. In combination with the white pawn on e5, it means that the king side is really in danger. And as we've already seen, one of the knights typically ends up on g5. all of this suggests that black should really consider bringing their bishop back to e7. When the f3 knight is pinned, advancing the g-pawn may be a good solution, but it has to be well timed. Otherwise, there are great chances for a counterattack. Take a moment to think about how to exploit the weaknesses in white's position. Since white's weaknesses are on the f-file, black can aim to exploit them with the move f5. Although black ends up having their own weakness on e6, they also have the bishop pair, well-placed knight on d5, and an excellent rook on f8, eyeing the weakness on f4 and the entire f-file. This could easily turn into a nightmare for white. One of the most straightforward plans for white can be seen in the following line: rook e8, e5, knight e5, bishop takes g6, pawn takes g6, and knight g5. Now we are familiar with this knight's potential, but now let's see how it plays out in a real game where c5 was played. Take a moment to think about how to continue the attack for white. The best move is queen f3, threatening f7, then queen h3, threatening mate, and the final touch, getting the rook involved with rook e1, followed by rook e4 to make things crystal clear with the move rook h4. Black may also try to avoid doubling their pawns on the g-file by moving the bishop to h5, pinning the knight. There are a couple of ways to deal with this pin, but the best is to waste no time and immediately continue with e5. Now, white can trade the knights, but let's see what happens in case of knight e4. Here we encounter another familiar situation where black's dark square bishop is useless on b4 and retreats to e7. Then knight g3, bishop g6, bishop take g6, h take g6, and the critical move h4. If black takes the free pawn, I'm gonna help you with the first move. The knight returns to e4. And then pause the video and think of possible plans for white, assuming that the black bishop stays on h4 on the next move. Alright, one of the plans is advancing g3, moving the king to g2 with an attack on the h-file. Alternatively, we can take the bishop and play bishop g5, forcing the queen into an awkward situation. Or we can leave the rook to a3, followed by rook h3. Either way, white is seriously better. Let's see what happens if white decides to take on d5 instead, destroying the black's outpost in the center, and then free up the knight with queen e3. Now, black has to be super careful. For instance, if a simple-looking move like rook c8 is played, let's just pause and think of how to continue the attack as white. And again, we can see the power behind the move knight g5. Now, usually black responds with bishop g6, we take, h take g6, and after queen h3, the game is pretty much over. When Carlsen encountered the move bishop e7 in this position, he still insisted on knight g5. The idea is that if h6, the knight retreats to h3 and then heads to f4, putting pressure on the bishop. But I'd like to ask you, what do you do in case of bishop g6? Feel free to pause and spend some time thinking. Magnus intended to take on g6 and play f4, creating an excellent attacking potential, especially if black captures on g5, because white can place the queen on h3 and continue with rook f4, h4. In the actual game, black gave up their bishop pair to neutralize these threats on the king side. Then white retreated to e2 to preserve the bishop, while black went for the typical knight maneuver to c6. But overall, white keeps an edge thanks to the bishop pair. At the end, we need to mention the pros and cons of moving the bishop from f5 to g4, as those are two different approaches for black in the main line Slav. Black moves the bishop to g4 not only because of the unpleasant pin, but it also keeps an eye on d4, making it difficult for white to seize the center with e4. But some players believe that playing bishop g4 and provoking the enemy pawns on the king side only helps white to develop their attack. That's why their bishop stays on f5. And they have the idea of preventing e4 by using their f6 knight and 2 bishops. Now, since they are not interested in putting pressure on d4, they can develop their other knight in front of the queen, keeping an option to castle long. And after our usual queen e2 to support e4, typically they retreat the bishop to g6, and they do this just before it gets threatened by the e-pawn. Now let's pause and think about advancing e4 anyway. Is it good, or do we need to invest more moves in preparing it? What black did to prevent e4 might seem like a bluff. It only appears that white cannot play it, due to bishop takes c3 and knight takes e4. However, after bishop a3, white has an excellent position. Let's see what happens if black continues with their pawn-grabbing strategy. We'll play queen b2. Black takes the third pawn. And here is a super clever move, queen b3. The idea is that after knight b6, we take on e6. If black takes the bishop, it's checkmate. And if they don't, we just open the e-file for our rooks. And black is lost.